My guest this week is the former US military intelligence analyst, Chelsea Manning. When she was 22, she made a decision that would change the rest of her life. She chose to leak hundreds of thousands of military reports to WikiLeaks about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, in a bid, as she would say, to educate the public about what was really going on. She was then arrested, held in a metal cage, and found guilty of theft and espionage, sentenced for 35 years in prison. President Barack Obama later commuted that sentence after 7 years served. Now she's put her account in a new book, and I want to ask her why she did what she did. Chelsea Manning, welcome to the programme. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
You were just 22 in 2010, working for the US military as an intelligence analyst, when you made a decision that would change the rest of your life. I was actually sitting in a bookshop back in America. You decided to leak hundreds of thousands of US military reports about the wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan to WikiLeaks. Why?
Well, I mean, there was a whole series of events that occurred before this. And as I write in a book, there was a whole sequence of events that led up to this. I had spent, several months in Iraq. I had, been an intelligence analyst for quite some time at this point. And I came to the realization that in my role and gradually as I was doing in this position, that there was a vast discrepancy, a huge chasm, and a distance of sort of understanding between what gradually came to be the on the ground reality of what I was seeing on the ground in Iraq, and to a slightly lesser extent in Afghanistan, versus what the public was aware of.
And yet, I wonder if you asked an average American on the street, could they name something that you revealed in that file? Could they think of something that they had learned before you leaked it? Do you think that they could, or what should come to mind that you revealed to the world that they didn't know before?
Yeah, I unfortunately, portions of the book are redacted because the U.S. government won't allow me to disclose that information.
But the nature of what you're sort of talking about, it's been reported it included footage which showed US soldiers allegedly targeting civilians, and then what turned out, as it's been reported, to be a Reuters photographer, for instance. So that's what's.
Well, allegedly, it has that was found. I think that.
Yes, sorry, but my point is, you're talking about redaction and what we're able to say and how things were reported as well at the time, but it's that sort of thing that you were trying to share with people, that essentially the military wasn't acting how people perhaps thought.
Well, I think it's actually more complicated than that. And even using that video as an example, it's less of a black and white and it's more of a gray. It's a grayscale video in that it shows the sort of complexities that are involved. It shows, not just an attack on a Reuters journalist, which is what, journalists seem to care about, but also on, a vehicle with, of unarmed civilians. And then the people on the ground, the soldiers on the ground who, when they uncover and reveal, and it's revealed to them like, oh, there are, injured children involved in this, then, you sort of see the best of, young U.S. soldiers, on the ground to try to, seek medical attention for kids. So I think that it's a much more complicated affair, and that's the whole reality of 21st century asymmetric warfare, in this time frame it is messy.
But essentially, you weren't just trying to show the good. You were trying to show the bad. You were trying to show what wasn't being reported, in your view. And do you feel that a better grasp on the truth was held by the American public through your leaking?
I don't know. You'll have to ask them. I feel like that was the goal and the intention. But sure, the American public, has this information available to them now. But, also so does history. So do other, points in time ahead of us. So, it's.
But it wasn't yours to give. You were convicted of espionage. You were convicted of theft. And
I was not. Look, I had a court martial and there were charges of unauthorized disclosure, but it doesn't belong. This kind of information, you can't hold on to this information. You're not going to be able to in the 21st century.
That's the point I'm making. As you say, you can ask the American public how they feel about that, and for some, you will be aware of this, view you as a traitor.
I mean, I don't encounter that on a daily basis. No, I don't.
No, but you will be aware. You will be aware that there is that view because of.
I mean, there's that view. There's that view, but it's usually among like people who are, hardly relevant to the 21st century society. Most of the people that say these kinds of things are are usually people in powerful positions or are in who are older. So generational. I think there's a sort of generational difference between, sort of people who are aware of how widespread, having access to information is in this era of, we live in the era of radical transparency now. That's the sense that I get.
Let's say that there are those who agree with what you're what you're talking about, the themes and the principles, but they still feel uncomfortable about the way you released the information to WikiLeaks. What would you say to them? That, did you do everything you could do to try and work within the systems that existed that were available to you within the army, within the military?
Those systems don't exist. Look, we can rehash this kind of history, and obviously I took responsibility for what happened. I made this decision. I did these things, and I went through a court martial and I went through this process. So, we've gone through this.
Well, no, it's just you've written a book about it. So I think it raises the questions again. You say rehashing. I'm just trying to hear from you what you think has changed as a result of it and how you engage with those who didn't feel comfortable.
Well, I think that now we live in a very different era. So I think in 2022, for instance, as a civilian, at my laptop computer in 2022, I look at I can look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for instance, and I see that now we're so awash in information that I feel like I have more access to information about an ongoing conflict in, say, March or April of 2022 than I did as an intelligence analyst in a classified environment in 2010.
Do you feel that about the US military? Do you feel it's more open now, that you have more access to that sort of information?
I do think so. I think that there's been, the 2010s are a turbulent sort of era for large institutions that were encountering the widespread access of information for the first time. We saw this, obviously in 2010. We saw this in 2013 with the other set of leaks that happened in 2013. We see this with cell phone cameras, where and broadband internet access being more widespread and available, with cell phone camera footage of police brutality, causing controversies now. So I think that we do live in an era in which now there's, because of the amount of, in fact, there's too much information. We're now in an era where it's very hard to discern valuable information that is validated from disinformation and misinformation.
Yeah, of course. The verification of information is a major battle. You talk about what happens to you, and I want to go into that, which you talk about in the book as well. But just on that point of writing this and putting it in a book, who's this book for? Who are you hoping to tell your story to, or convince perhaps of why you did what you did or what you were hoping to achieve?
So I view this book as a coming of age story for me, and I've aimed this book towards a younger version of myself. Right, this is essentially a book that I wrote with myself at the age of 15 in mind. Right, I dedicated this book to sort of young trans people as well, who are and that's how I view this. This is I'm not much of a fan of the thriller novel, so I didn't want to tell that kind of story. I wanted to tell a coming of age story because it's not even really a memoir. This is about a time period in my life in which I am very young, and I'm still kind of young.
Yeah,
so,
no, you are.
Yeah, I'm in my mid-30s, so I'm just starting to get my life together.
Well, and it's quite a coming of age story because of then, as you say, taking responsibility. What happens to you? You're transported to Kuwait, and a metal bar cage for 49 days is part of your experience. Well, you tell me, but I did want to ask, because you do then go on to do several spells of solitary confinement, but can you describe what that is like for us?
Sure. So solitary confinement is it's kind of hard to describe, and it was actually really hard to write about because there's not a lot that's happening, right?
Yeah.
You know, it is there's a lot of sensory deprivation. There is a sort of focus on food, on sleep, on just trying to regulate your own body.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember in Kuwait in particular, it's actually very fuzzy and foggy because of how hot it was. It was like in the high 30s to high to mid 40s in temperature. In Kuwait, and I was and it was like it was dark, and like I just, it's very hard to write about this time period, for a number of different reasons, because there's not a lot happening, and also there's just this hyper awareness that starts to develop on the sort of conditions around you, and this sense of self, and the sense of like self-awareness about yourself. I mean, it almost feels like a more animalistic period, for me, where it's not like I'm not even thinking almost in words. I'm just thinking of just food and sleep and trying to get through the next period of time, and
Survival.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I read, and you tell me again, that you didn't think you were actually going to go to prison, and then for doing what you did. So you go from that to this, which is such an extraordinary contrast, I imagine, as well.
Yeah, and it was very unexpected. And this has never happened before. So
would you have still leaked, Chelsea, if you knew you were going to go to prison?
I'm not gonna speculate on what I what I would have done if I had known something different. But I look, I can't change what happened.
Yeah.
I can't do anything about I would have been a different person if I had made any other decisions. It would have required me to sort of have a different background or for a different set of circumstances. But I think that I think that even the potentiality of losing my career, and the potentiality of being discharged, and of losing my security clearance, and essentially being cast aside and cast out of the military, and essentially working back at Starbucks, gave me pause. It was that was definitely enough to that was definitely enough to be that was those I viewed those in terms of like having a career at this time. These were major consequences.
And then there were the consequences, which were much more major, as you say, and you get a sentence of 35 years,
Mm-hmm.
and going to America, then in jail. And I also understand you were in a position where you tried to take your own life on 2 occasions, which
Mm-hmm.
gives a sense to anyone who's just perhaps coming to your story about how difficult this was.
I have had quite a journey.
Yeah.
And obviously, there are time periods in which you lose hope, and you give up, and but you can also get past that, and I'm thankful that I'm here and that I have been able to grow and develop and meet people and have the friends and the support network and the wonderful people that I have in my life, and that I'm able to see my family again.
It doesn't end up being
Mm-hmm.
35 years because Barack Obama commuted
Right.
your sentence, President Barack Obama. One of his last acts as president. Why do you think he freed you? What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, he said what the reason why, which is, Chelsea served a tough sentence, and it was disproportionate. So he's obviously weighed in here. It's not that he views it as that I didn't do anything wrong at all, right? in his mind. So, but I took responsibility. I served a significant period of time in prison. So that was his rationale. That was the one he stated.
People may not realize you did go back to jail in 2019 to 2020. This is when you refused to testify before a grand jury investigating Julian Assange.
Well, I mean, I want to clarify.
Yeah, please do.
Because the U.S. government never acknowledged that, and they actually denied that it was targeting a specific individual.
Okay.
So we don't know. I do know that I was asked specific questions regarding the 2010 disclosures. So my lawyers obviously speculated that it might be about a specific individual, but from our perspective, it could have been anybody. It was not limited to a specific individual.
And on that point, then, for what you do know and what we know, what we now know you don't know as well, why didn't you want to do that?
So the grand jury process is a very problematic one in the U.S. It's used almost exclusively against people in very high profile and political cases. In various instances throughout history, this has been used to sort of go after people whenever they've like double jeopardy is at play or immunity has already been conferred or something like that. And so I viewed this as sort of the U.S. government getting back at me for the commutation of in 2017
for what had happened then. Okay, so that's your reasoning, because some took that. I know that you're saying about the individual, but some people took that or may have taken that as your support for Julian Assange. Is that right?
I don't. I know that there was an indictment that was unsealed during the process, and so the fact that an indictment was unsealed during that process and I was still incarcerated, for something that had already been indicted, leads me to believe that it wasn't for that. So obviously, the investigation at that time was for something bigger.
But do you support Julian Assange?
I find it problematic that the U.S. government is going after, the individuals involved in the events of 2010. Yes.
Okay. Are you in touch? Do you have a relationship? Because it was WikiLeaks to which you released these documents.
I don't know if I've ever had any direct contact.
Okay. It's just, we're speaking and it's a chance on the record to say what you want to say about that.
Well, I find it problematic. Obviously, them going after all of the people involved in the disclosures, I think in this manner and in this way is I think very problematic. And I think that as this unfolds and as it grows, and it goes and it gets I don't know how much I don't know who else is going to be brought into this. I don't know how much bigger it's going to get, but I'm alarmed at this case and at how the U.S. government is approaching this. That's all I can say.
Do you feel it's over for you, or do you still worry about this? Is this something that keeps you up at night?
I think it's over for me. For me personally, I think that this is a chapter that is closed. I've said what I've said. I've gone on record. I've taken responsibility. I think that, and I'm eager to get on with my life. I'm eager to. One of the reasons I wrote this book was to essentially, go on record and to build and to grow and to say, look, go to the book, here's my story for the stuff that happened 12 years ago that almost has no bearing on my daily life.
Yes, but going back to jail in 2019 to 2020 must have been extremely difficult, to say the least.
No.
I imagine. No, it wasn't a dark period to be back without your freedom.
No, I honestly, I'm so severely institutionalized that the idea of going back to jail is, honestly, jail is not a scary place to me. It is, there's a part, there's a kernel inside of me that sort of views, prison as being sort of just like high school or just like.
Really?
Yeah, I think so. I think that
That's fascinating.
It's a place where I've spent a significant period of time. And I find it difficult, I honestly find it more difficult out here because I've spent so much time in prison that I kind of view the world through the lens of prison first, because like I understand sort of how prison and institutions work. I mean, obviously school, military, prison, and out here is a bit messier, and I'm still trying to navigate things, and it's kind of tough.
Well, no, I just find that really fascinating because what you seem to be saying, but you tell me, is that being free can be harder, and more frightening at times.
Especially if that's what you know, right?
Yeah.
Because what I know, there's a familiarity with being in an imprisoned environment, right? In a carceral environment. Like there's a familiarity with that. Like I know what tomorrow brings in that kind of environment. I know how I know sort of how the social dynamics work. I know, it's a very, it's a very structured kind of environment. And out here it's messier.
Do you miss prison in any way?
I think that I certainly think that, like, just like any other institution that somebody can stay at for a significant period of time, I think that there is a nostalgic feeling that comes with that. It doesn't necessarily mean that that I want that. Obviously, prison is not an ideal place to be in. But yeah, I think that there is I certainly have just like in combat and being in a war zone, like there are nostalgic feelings that come with those kinds of time frames. And the sense of support that I had from from either the other inmates that I had, or from the friends that I built, or the relationships that I built.
Well, no, I was also going to come on to, we talked a bit about how some may feel not favourably towards what you did, but it's also been reported that you received 270,000 letters.
I did.
In prison. I don't know.
Yes.
I mean, that's extraordinary. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I received so many letters. I couldn't read them all. I do remember that the United States Disciplinary Barracks, the prison that we had, I think they had to hire additional staff in order to go through it all, because they obviously couldn't hand stuff over to me. And I did keep some of the negative pieces. I think I got 11 pieces of negative mail the entire time.
Okay, so you're someone who likes your statistics, and that's a pretty good ratio.
Yeah, well, I'm a data scientist.
Yes.
That's what I do.
Oh, and are you still a data scientist? Because I also read someone's described you recently as a socialite. I see you in Vogue posing, and also as a DJ. So you seem to have several roles at the moment.
Yeah, I'm doing all of the things that I missed and that I didn't get to do. Now that I've written the book, which took up quite a chunk of time, I'm able to sort of do these things. And obviously the pandemic sort of, it's been a messy few years. So I do a number of different things, but ultimately I would say that currently my job is essentially to be a security consultant. I work for a number of different clients, one of whom is a privacy-focused company that is working on a privacy-based project that actually is based on an idea that I proposed in 2016.
Okay, so that's kind of the day job, and by night, DJ, party attender, whatever's happening.
Yes, I have been known to be a party animal throughout my life.
Chelsea Manning, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being with us. Until we meet again, take care and goodbye.